She turns off the kitchen light and walks to her bedroom. For a moment, the apartment is completely still. Then, from somewhere behind the refrigerator, something moves. An antenna emerges first, testing the air, reading the darkness, confirming what it already knows. Then another antenna. Then 6 legs carry a flat, dark body across the floor, with a speed that seems impossible for something so small. It reaches the counter, finds the gap beside the sink, pauses for less than a second, and disappears. She has no idea it was there. She has no idea that in the walls around her, in the spaces behind her appliances, in the drainage system running beneath her building, and beneath every building on her street, there are hundreds more, possibly thousands, moving through the darkness with a confidence that does not come from intelligence or planning or any kind of awareness that she exists at all. It comes from something far older than intelligence. 330 million years of practice. Humans have been trying to kill the cockroach for as long as we have shared buildings with it. We have deployed the most powerful insecticides ever synthesized. We have poisoned its food supply. We have engineered its genetics. We have funded research programs, developed bait systems, designed rotation strategies, coordinated international campaigns, and spent billions of dollars across more than a century of sustained scientific effort directed at a single insect that weighs less than a paperclip. It is still here, not just surviving, thriving, in every city on Earth, in hospitals and restaurants and schools and government buildings and the spaces between the walls of structures that pass every health inspection on record. In the drainage systems beneath streets we walk every single day, without once thinking about what moves through them at night. In the infrastructure of human civilization so completely and so thoroughly that removing it would require dismantling the cities themselves. The question that has occupied pest control scientists, public health researchers, and evolutionary biologists for over a century is not whether the cockroach can be killed. Individual cockroaches die every second of every day, from chemicals, from predators, from starvation, from the physical hazards of the environments they move through constantly without rest or strategy or anything resembling a survival plan. The question is why killing them never seems to matter. Why the exterminator returns to find the same kitchen occupied by the same population 3 weeks after a treatment that should have eliminated it. Why the bait that worked in the first year stops working in the second. Why every control campaign that begins with genuine scientific confidence ends with the population restored, and the researchers reaching for a new approach that will eventually produce the same result. The answer to all of those questions is the same answer. And it begins not in an apartment and not in a laboratory, but in a coal swamp 330 million years ago, in a world so completely different from anything alive today that it barely resembles the same planet. Picture vast swamps stretching across continents that have not yet separated into the shapes on any map you have ever seen. No mammals, no birds, no flowering plants, no grass. The atmosphere contains roughly 30% more oxygen than exists today, enough that a fire started in that environment would burn with an intensity that has no modern equivalent. Enormous primitive trees, some reaching 40 meters, rise out of standing water, their roots spreading through mud that will eventually compress over geological time into the coal seams that human miners will extract hundreds of millions of years in the future. And moving through the rotting vegetation at the edges of those swamps, in the standing water and the decaying organic matter that covers the ground between the trees, a creature appears in the fossil record that stops anyone who first encounters it. Not because it looks ancient, because it looks like what is behind your refrigerator right now. The flattened oval body, the long antennae extending forward to read the environment before the body arrives. The 6 legs positioned for speed rather than strength. The body that sits low and wide and close to whatever surface it is crossing. The cockroach body plan that emerges in fossils from 330 million years ago is immediately and completely recognizable to anyone alive today. While the world around it changed beyond any recognition, while entire kingdoms of animals rose to dominance and then vanished completely and were replaced by entirely different kingdoms, while the continents moved and the atmosphere changed and the seas rose and fell and rose again, that body plan stayed. Not because nothing challenged it. Everything challenged it. 5 separate mass extinction events, each one severe enough to eliminate the majority of complex life on Earth, each one testing the cockroach the same way they tested everything else alive at the time. The cockroach passed every test, not because it was the strongest animal in its environment. It was not. not because it was the fastest or the most intelligent or the most chemically sophisticated. There were animals in those carboniferous swamps that would have eaten a cockroach without noticing. The cockroach survived not by being better than its competitors at any one thing, but by being adequate at everything. By being the animal that could function across the widest possible range of conditions, the generalist in a world that kept changing the rules. That strategy, the generalist strategy, is the foundation of everything that follows. It is why the cockroach behind the refrigerator is there. It is why the exterminator's treatment does not hold. It is why every approach that has ever been seriously directed at cockroach elimination has produced the same arc of initial success, followed by eventual failure. The cockroach was not built for your kitchen specifically. It was built for any environment. And your kitchen, your building, your city, your civilization, is just the latest environment it has encountered in 330 million years of encountering new environments and surviving every single one of them. But understanding the strategy is not the same as understanding the mechanism. To understand why the cockroach can fit through any gap in any building in any city on Earth, you need to look at the body itself. And when researchers looked closely enough to measure what that body can actually do, the numbers they recorded were not what anyone had expected to find. Take the gap beside the sink, the one the cockroach disappeared into tonight. It is thinner than a coin. Most people assume the cockroach fits through it because the cockroach is small. That assumption is wrong. The cockroach fits through it because of what its exoskeleton can do under compression. Researchers filming cockroaches with high-speed cameras as they entered progressively smaller gaps found something that required multiple viewings to fully process. As the gap narrowed, the cockroach did not slow down. It did not hesitate. It compressed its body to a quarter of its normal standing height and continued running at full speed through the gap. And the forces applied to that exoskeleton during the compression, forces equivalent to 900 times the animal's own body weight, produced no structural damage whatsoever. 900 times its body weight, absorbed completely. The cockroach emerged from the other side of the gap, running at the same speed it entered. No injury, no recovery period, no detectable effect on its behavior or movement. An engineer examining those numbers would describe the exoskeleton as a material that does not exist in human manufacturing. A flexible load-bearing composite that maintains structural integrity under compression ratios and force loads that would destroy any synthetic material of equivalent weight. The gap beside the sink is not a flaw in the building's construction. It is a door. A door that exists in every building ever constructed by human beings, in every city, in every country, in every climate zone on Earth, and that this particular animal was always going to be able to use because it has been using equivalent doors in equivalent environments since before the first tree grew tall enough to cast a meaningful shadow. And that door leads somewhere that most pest control programs have never fully reckoned with, somewhere that changes the entire framework of how the cockroach problem needs to be understood. In the winter of 2018 in Chicago, a researcher crouched in the drainage tunnels beneath an apartment complex with a headlamp and a collection kit, and began documenting something that the pest control industry had understood in a general sense for decades, but had never quantified with the precision necessary to understand what it actually meant for treatment outcomes. The cockroaches in the drainage system were not the same as the ones in the apartments above. They were larger, darker, they moved more slowly, and with less of the rapid evasion behavior that characterizes cockroaches in human-occupied spaces when they are exposed to light. They did not scatter when the headlamp came on. They adjusted, they waited, they moved with the deliberate pace of animals that had not recently been disturbed by human activity because they lived in spaces where human activity did not routinely reach. These were not the cockroaches that residents were calling about. These were the source of those cockroaches. The reservoir, the core population living in the drainage infrastructure, and the pipe networks, and the spaces within walls and beneath foundations that connect apartment to apartment, building to building, block to block, through the underground architecture of the city itself. This population is never treated. It cannot be treated in any meaningful sense, because accessing it comprehensively would require dismantling infrastructure that the building and the city cannot function without. The pipes cannot be removed. The drainage tunnels cannot be sealed. The spaces within walls cannot be opened and closed without rebuilding the structure. And so the reservoir persists, generation after generation, in spaces that every pest control program has ever deployed has failed to reach. What the research documented was the number that the pest control industry found most difficult to incorporate into its operational model. The visible cockroach population in a treated building, the population that residents see and health inspectors measure and exterminators target, could be completely and verifiably eliminated. Every specimen gone, no detectable activity remaining, and the population would be fully restored from the drainage reservoir beneath the building within 2 to 3 weeks. Without a single cockroach crossing the threshold from an adjacent building, without any external source of reinfestation, the building refills from below, through gaps that connect the drainage system to the living spaces above, through the same routes the cockroaches have always used, and that no sealing compound reliably closes permanently. The exterminator treating the kitchen is treating the reflection of the problem. The problem is beneath the floor. But what sustained that underground population in environments with almost no conventional food was something that puzzled researchers until they looked inside the cockroach itself. Deep inside, at the cellular level, where something extraordinary had been happening for approximately 200 million years without anyone noticing until modern molecular biology made it visible. Living inside cockroach cells, not in the gut where most symbiotic bacteria reside, but inside the cells themselves, is a community of bacteria called Bladobacterium. This relationship is so ancient and so deeply integrated into cockroach biology that the bacteria can no longer survive outside cockroach cells, and the cockroach cannot fully thrive without them. 200 million years of coevolution so intimate that the two organisms have become functionally a single system. And what that system does is something that has no equivalent in any vertebrate animal. It recycles the cockroach's own metabolic waste back into usable nutrition. Every animal produces nitrogen-containing waste compounds as byproducts of normal metabolism. In most animals, these compounds must be excreted because they accumulate to toxic levels and cannot be reused. In the cockroach, Bladobacterium intercepts those compounds and converts them back into amino acids, back into protein, back into the raw materials of biological function. A cockroach in a drainage tunnel with nothing to eat is not slowly burning reserves and progressing towards starvation the way a vertebrate would. It is running a closed-loop internal recycling system, feeding on the chemistry of its own existence, sustaining itself on metabolic exhaust that any other animal would simply expel and lose. This is why the reservoir population does not starve in drainage infrastructure. This is why cockroaches survive in sealed spaces, where conventional wisdom says they should run out of food within days. This is why the underground population that restocks the treated apartment building every 3 weeks never depletes. It is not dependent on finding external food. It is dependent on its own continued existence, which provides all the inputs the recycling loop needs to keep running. Put any organic material in that environment at all. The microscopic grease film on the inside of a drain pipe, the cellulose in the paper wrapping of an old cable, the skin cells that settle into every surface where human beings have ever spent time. And the population does not just sustain itself. It expands. The urban environment, which human beings experience as a built structure made of concrete and steel and glass, the cockroach experiences as an unlimited and continuously replenished food source distributed across every surface human civilization has ever touched. Every city ever built by human hands has been, from the cockroach's perspective, a feeding opportunity of essentially unlimited scale. But the story of how the cockroach survives beneath is only one side of what makes elimination impossible. The other side is what happens when humans attack from above. And that story begins with a moment that felt, for a brief and genuinely hopeful period of scientific history, like it might be the end of the problem entirely. In the years immediately following World War II, a chemical called DDT transformed public health in ways that had seemed impossible a decade earlier. Mosquito populations collapsed in treated areas. Malaria rates fell across entire regions. Disease burdens that had shaped the course of human history for thousands of years began to lift. Public health officials spoke with genuine confidence about a future where insect-borne illness would become a relic of the past. And for a moment, that same confidence was directed at cockroaches. If DDT could empty marshes of mosquitoes and protect entire armies from typhus, surely it could clear kitchens of cockroaches. In the buildings where DDT was first sprayed, cockroach populations collapsed. The results seemed to confirm what public health officials had hoped. This was the answer. Then something happened. Not immediately. At first it was barely noticeable, a few cockroaches in treated buildings surviving exposures that the dosage calculations said should be lethal. Researchers noted it, adjusted their methods, increased concentrations. The population dropped again, then stabilized again, and in the spaces between the data points, something the models had not fully accounted for was happening at the genetic level in populations across multiple treatment sites simultaneously. The few survivors were reproducing. In a species that produces a new generation every few weeks, in which a single female can be the ancestor of thousands of individuals within a single year, the genetic variants that had allowed those few survivors to withstand DDT exposure were spreading through the population with a speed that the resistance models of the 1950s had not been designed to predict. What had been a rare anomaly in the population, a handful of individuals with a slightly different biochemical response to the compound, became first a minority, then a plurality, then the majority, then the entire character of the population. The chemical designed to eliminate cockroaches was teaching the cockroach how to survive it. Every application that killed the susceptible individuals and left the resistant ones was not reducing the population permanently. It was selecting the next generation, building the resistant population that would be sprayed next time, and the time after that, and the time after that, until the compound that had seemed revolutionary was failing in the populations where it had once produced dramatic results, and a new compound was needed. Pest control moved to new chemicals, different mechanisms, different molecular targets. The assumption was that resistance to one compound would not transfer to another. For a period, that held. New compounds produced new results. For a period. Then the same pattern repeated. And repeated again. And when researchers began compiling the timeline data on resistance emergence across decades of insecticide deployment, the trend revealed something that went beyond the straightforward story of resistance evolution. In the 1980s, a new insecticide retained full effectiveness for between 3 and 5 years before population-level resistance emerged. By the 2000s, that window had narrowed to 18 months. By the 2010s, some compounds were showing resistance emergence within a single field season. The cockroach was not just developing resistance. It was developing it faster with each successive generation of chemical pressure. As if each wave of insecticide exposure was producing a population not just resistant to that specific compound, but slightly better equipped to handle the next one. Faster to recognize chemical threat. Faster to produce the biological response that neutralized it. Researchers designed rotation programs to counter this, deploying compounds with fundamentally different mechanisms of action in sequence, so that resistance to one pathway would not confer any advantage against a completely different pathway. The logic was sound. The evidence supporting it from agricultural pest management was substantial. The strategy was implemented with genuine scientific rigor in field trials across multiple urban populations. The cockroach populations in those trials did not develop resistance to the compounds in sequence. They developed something broader, an enhancement of the detoxification enzyme systems already present in their biology. Systems that chemically modify toxic compounds before those compounds can reach any biological target, regardless of which specific compound is being deployed or which molecular pathway it is designed to attack. The cockroach populations exposed to rotation programs were not evolving targeted resistance to specific insecticides. They were evolving generalist chemical defense capacity, a biological system capable of handling broad categories of toxicity simultaneously, becoming more efficient with each generation of selection pressure irrespective of which specific chemistry was doing the selecting. They had not evolved resistance to a chemical. They had evolved resistance to chemistry as a category. The entire strategic framework of insecticide rotation, built on the assumption that resistance was mechanism-specific, had encountered an organism that responded to chemical pressure not by targeting the specific mechanism, but by enhancing its general capacity to neutralize chemical threat. The cockroach had applied the same generalist logic to chemical defense that its body plan had applied to environmental survival, not specialized to defeat any particular threat, adequate against an enormous range of threats simultaneously. Pest control had no strategic answer for that discovery, but even that was not the moment that changed everything. In research facilities in North Carolina, a different problem had been developing quietly. Bait programs, which represented the most significant advance in cockroach control in decades, were failing in specific apartment populations in ways that could not be explained by any existing resistance model. The baits combined an insecticide with glucose, the sugar that cockroaches had been reliably attracted to in every behavioral study ever conducted on the species. Cockroaches were supposed to find the bait, eat it, carry traces of it back to their populations, and spread the insecticide through the colony. In laboratory conditions, the approach was extraordinarily effective. In controlled trials, population reductions were dramatic and consistent. In certain buildings in Raleigh and Durham, cockroaches were walking past the bait without touching it, not avoiding it because they detected the insecticide component, not learning over time that the bait stations were associated with danger. When individual cockroaches from those buildings were brought into the laboratory and tested in isolation on their responses to glucose and other taste stimuli, the results came back in a way that required multiple rounds of independent verification before anyone would commit to publishing them. These cockroaches were experiencing glucose as bitter, the neural pathway in the gustatory sensory system that in every other tested cockroach population fired to signal sweetness, the pathway that evolution had spent millions of years calibrating to attract cockroaches toward sugar as a fundamental food source, was in these populations firing instead along the circuit that signals bitterness. The circuit that produces avoidance rather than attraction. The circuit that means do not eat this. The cockroach had not detected the poison in the bait and learned to avoid the bait as a result. The cockroach had rewired the sensory experience of the bait's attractant itself, had changed, at the neurological level, what glucose felt like, had taken the very compound that the bait strategy was built around and converted it from something pleasant into something aversive. This happened in approximately 20 years. In the specific period during which glucose-based baits had been deployed in those populations. Natural selection had identified the attractant as the consistent factor appearing immediately before death, and had produced a sensory rewiring so thorough that the compound now triggered the opposite behavioral response from the one the bait strategy depended on. When this was published in Science, the pest control industry understood immediately that it was encountering something qualitatively different from ordinary resistance. Resistance is when an organism develops the ability to survive a toxic compound. What this was something more fundamental. The cockroach had identified the logic of a control strategy, the logic that said attract the cockroach to the bait with something it finds appealing, and had evolved around the logic rather than around the specific chemistry. It had changed what it found appealing. If it could do that in 20 years in response to bait glucose, what would it do in the next 20 years in response to whatever replaced glucose as the attractant? What would it do in the 20 years after that? And the 20 years after that? Those questions were still being processed when the most disturbing discovery connected to cockroach biology came not from a pest control trial, but from a hospital infection control investigation in São Paulo, Brazil. For months, patients in a large medical facility had been developing infections caused by bacterial strains with resistance profiles that did not match what was circulating in the community outside the hospital. The infections were appearing in patients who shared no obvious common exposure, who had not been in contact with each other, who had undergone different procedures in different parts of the facility. The source was not immediately apparent. The investigation moved through the clinical spaces systematically, through patient rooms and procedure areas, and staff facilities, and storage and supply. And eventually, it went somewhere that infection control investigations do not routinely go, into the drainage tunnels beneath the hospital. In the pipe infrastructure running under the patient wards, cockroaches had been moving at night between the drainage systems and the clinical areas above, entering through the same gaps in the building's infrastructure that no pest control program had been able to permanently seal. The cockroaches themselves were not sick. They were not infected in any meaningful sense. But on the surfaces of their bodies, in the microscopic landscape of their legs and exoskeletons, they were carrying bacterial strains that had evolved resistance in the antibiotic-saturated environment of the hospital's own drainage infrastructure. Strains shaped by decades of antibiotic use in the facility above. Strains that the cockroaches were transporting from the underground environment where those strains had developed directly into the spaces where the most vulnerable patients in the building were receiving care. A comprehensive control program was implemented. The most thorough intervention the facility could organize within its operational constraints. 6 months after the intervention began, transport events were still being recorded. The drainage infrastructure was decades old. Sealing it comprehensively would require reconstruction that no functioning hospital could undertake without closing the facility entirely. The cockroach population in the tunnels could be reduced. It could not be eliminated. And in a hospital, reduced is not enough. The bridge between the place where drug resistance evolves and the place where drug resistance kills remained open. Now hold all of that together and look at what you are actually looking at. The cockroach that disappeared beside the sink tonight can compress its body through gaps too small for any sealing compound to reliably close across the lifetime of a building. It lives in a reservoir population beneath the structure that no surface treatment reaches and that can fully restock any treated space within weeks, through routes that remain permanently accessible. It sustains itself in that reservoir by recycling its own metabolic waste when conventional food sources are unavailable. When insecticide programs are directed at it, the population evolves enhanced detoxification capacity across broad categories of chemistry rather than developing targeted resistance to specific compounds. When bait attractants are used to lure it, it evolves new sensory responses that convert the attractant from appealing to aversive within a human generation. And as it moves between the underground infrastructure of the city and the occupied spaces above, it carries on its body whatever microbial environment it just passed through, including drug-resistant bacterial strains that human medicine is struggling to treat. None of this is intelligent. None of it is planned. The cockroach does not know that humans have been trying to eliminate it. It does not experience its survival as a victory or its resistance as a strategy. It experiences nothing in any sense we would recognize. It does not think. It does not remember. It does not adapt consciously. What it does is run a process. The same process it has been running for 330 million years. Every individual that is not quite well enough adapted to its current environment fails to reproduce. Every individual fractionally better equipped to survive passes that fraction forward to the next generation. Over 30 million centuries, across 5 mass extinction events, across every climate the planet has produced, and every predator the planet has evolved, and every chemical environment the planet has generated, those fractions accumulate into a body that compresses through any gap, into a metabolism that feeds on its own exhaust, into a detoxification system that handles chemistry as a category, into a sensory system that rewires itself around whatever signal precedes death, into a reproductive rate that means any population that survives a treatment in any number is sufficient to restore the full population before the next treatment can be organized. The woman who turned off her kitchen light is not losing a battle against a pest. She is encountering the accumulated outcome of 330 million years of selection pressure, more sustained and more thorough than anything humanity has directed at any problem in its entire existence. The pest control industry is not failing. The science is not failing. The billions of dollars are not being wasted. They are all encountering the same thing. A process older than trees, that has survived everything the planet has produced. That incorporates every pressure directed at it as information about what the next generation needs to be fractionally better at surviving than this one. That does not respond to elimination efforts by dying, it responds by becoming better at not dying. That is the answer the question has always been pointing toward. Cockroaches refuse to die not because any individual cockroach is indestructible. They refuse to die because the process that produces cockroaches has been running longer than almost any other process on Earth, and it has encountered extinction pressure before, many times, in forms that make anything humanity has directed at it look modest by comparison. And it is still running. The kitchen is quiet now. The woman is asleep. And in the walls around her, in the drainage system beneath her feet, in the spaces between and below and behind every structure in the city outside her window, the machine that started running 330 million years ago has not paused and has not slowed and has not found any reason to stop. It never stops. That is why cockroaches refuse to die. Not because they are trying to, but because after 330 million years of everything the world could produce to challenge them, refusing to die is the only thing they have ever known how to do. And they have had a very long time to get good at it.